my name is Mike Konczal. I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm an economics and finance blogger at Rortybomb, and I am joined by
Peter Frase. I'm an editor at Jacobin magazine, where I'm a writer and blogger.
Excellent. And this is the first edition, or the second edition, my first edition of Roosevelt Institute's Fireside Chats. Today we're going to be talking about the legacy of President Obama over the past 3 years and the general left. We'll be talking about Occupy Wall Street. We're going to be talking about the future of work and jobs, talking about Foxconn and robots and labor and Apple and all kinds of other great stuff. And we're going to probably end it with a conversation about future of liberalism and what it looks like, both public institutions, the way government's evolved. And I think it's going to be a really exciting time. But before that, we're going to do a quick commercial here. This is the second edition of something called Fireside Chats. Blogging Heads, as you may know, and you may see on the sidebar, has split up its content into daily shows that are produced weekly. In Roosevelt Institute, we'll have a weekly show. My colleague Mark Schmidt did the first one last week, and he'll be doing several, and many of my other colleagues, including Ellen Chesler, Dorian Warner, many others will be joining in with special guests to talk about the issues of the day. And for my first one, I'm very excited to be joined by Peter Frase, a writer and thinker whose work I discovered last year, along with Jacobin magazine. And I think it's a great magazine, it's a great crew and a great community they've built there, and I think it's a really exciting thing going forward. So I'm excited to talk to him today about some of his ideas. Can you give us a little bit of background about Jacobin, how it's got started and where it is right now?
Yeah, so Jacobin was launched in 2010 by our editor-in-chief, who's a young whiz kid impresario, Bhaskar Sunkara. And Bhaskar, while still in college, decided that what the world needed was a magazine of the radical left, printed on glossy paper. And apparently it was what some small part of the world needed, because it's really achieved a broader audience and more success than I would have expected. We are trying to bring sort of a radical left perspective, sort of a left, critiquing liberalism from the left. I think what we bring, that sort of distinguishes us is, first of all, that we're not really tied to the sectarian debates of sort of earlier generations of leftists. We're all fairly young. The Bhaskar and then the other three principal editors, who are myself, Seth Ackerman, and Mike Beggs. And so we're not tied to the old sort of social democracy versus the Soviet Union versus China versus whatever kinds of debates. And at the same time, we're trying to bring like left-wing critiques out of the sort of academic ghetto where they found themselves after the collapse of the movements of the 60s. So we may draw on, the academic philosophers or academic Marxists, but we're trying to bring those perspectives to a broader audience.
And one thing that surprises me, and I think maybe Bhaskar, being so young and fresh out of college, being one of the principal editors of this, is that it's hopeful is not the right word, but it's engaged. It doesn't have that resignation of a lot of left publications you read. One thing that struck me, and we've talked about this before, is it strikes me as I'm in my early 30s, and I know you are as well. It strikes me somewhat similar to the Baffler a little bit, but Baffler is a very resignated kind of. It assumes that in some sense the battle's been lost, and it's about where can we recoup certain victories. Where your magazine strikes me as much more assertive and engaged and aggressive, and I think that's very interesting, because I think the moment calls for it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is, and I do think that it's something that, it's certainly sort of how I try to approach things. It's how Bhaskar tries to approach things, and I agree with you. The Baffler is something that I loved when it was in its heyday. It's definitely been an influence on me, just in terms of its kind of stylishness and its way of doing a political magazine in a way that is reaches sort of a broader audience than the sectarian niche. But it's true that it did have that kind of spirit of resignation, and I think my perspective, and I think a lot of the perspective of a lot of us at the magazine, is that it's the Gramsci expression, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. If you don't think that a better world is possible and that there are hopeful tendencies in the present, there's sort of there's no point in doing politics.
I also like that you're significantly to the left of me, which means that I am the right-wing person on this left versus right talk show, which is very exciting. These things are normally scheduled to be left versus right, and sometimes they're right versus right, but they're very left. They're very rarely left versus liberal. So it's exciting to be the right winger here. I don't know how to react to it.
Yeah, it's fun, right? And I mean, and this is what another thing we really try to do. I think is we try at Jacobin, we try to speak to people who are just to our right. We're not as interested in sort of debating within the left, although we do that, and we're also not really we don't spend as much time sort of critiquing the right because we feel that's sort of shooting fish in a barrel. And in any case, liberals do a pretty good job of that. So it's really this conversation between liberals and the left that's really of greatest interest to us.
Excellent. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the past 3 years. There's obviously a very big election coming up. A very big presidency is ending its first term. We just saw a bunch of gigantic media profiles of the first year of the Obama administration. Andrew Sullivan did one, I believe it was for Newsweek. Noam Schreiber did one for the New Republic. Ryan Lizza did a big thing for the New Yorker. James Fallows did it for the Atlantic. I'm sure there will be a ton. There's been secondary criticisms of all of them. Rick Perlstein wrote a really good one for Rolling Stone. And I'm sure there will be a ton more. But all of these are somewhat situated within the left liberal spectrum. And there, I think, especially if you take one step to the left and you kind of get in the left liberal space, so you're away from someone like Andrew Sullivan, who I think approves very greatly of Obama, thinks Obama's in charge, thinks a lot of what a lot of people view as strategic mistakes and lapsed opportunities were very kind of what we call 11-dimensional chess, that it was really thought out in advance. What I sense, and I'll go back to this after you give it a go, but in the left liberal space, where what there is an overwhelming sense of disappointment in the first administration, first term of the Obama administration. There the two pillars of criticism are usually Paul Krugman and Glenn Greenwald, who both I think sensed a very big missed opportunity. Both people, I think, who caught it early on, perhaps before the election, that something was amiss. Greenwald with how he went after a telecom immunity, Krugman with how he situated himself with Republicans. And then if you look at a lot of the institutional infrastructure of the progressive movement, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Sierra Club, the other environmentalists, in general, I think they felt that the Obama administration has not been aggressive enough, that big things have been missed, big things have been ignored, and we'll talk about some specifics. Obviously, no one, I think, is going to vote for, Rick Santorum or Mitt Romney, but I think there's a sense that there's a problem here. And some of it kind of falls into the vague notion of, quote, changing the conversation, that there's this Republican domination over the past 30 years, this neoconservative movement, and the coalition has not been destroyed, and ideologically it's still in place, very much, even though we're in a kind of Great Depression moment. I'm curious about the broader left, and I'm going to let you define what you mean by that. How have you guys viewed the past 3 years? And I'm under the working assumption, to frame it, that you are perhaps less disappointed in President Obama because you do not expect that much, but you're perhaps more disappointed that this Great Recession, this Great Depression-like financial crisis hasn't really disrupted neoliberalism's control over the policy debates. And I'll let you go here.
Right. So I can't obviously speak for the whole broad left, which I would basically define as everyone who thinks that, the mainstream of the Democratic Party politics is too far to the right. Which goes all the way from sort of left liberals to, people of various anti-capitalist persuasions, which is sort of where I and Jacobin find ourselves. I think it's interesting that you brought up Krugman and Greenwald as sort of the two poles of critique of the Obama administration, because they, of course, they focus on two different parts of it. And one part of it is, from my perspective, much more of an actual disappointment than the other. My personal view with Obama is I got taken in by this guy way back in 2004 when he was first running for the Senate in Illinois. I was living in Chicago then, and I volunteered for the campaign when he was first in the primaries, because at the time I thought, this guy, as a lot of other people did at the time, that this is a guy who could potentially be like a Paul Wellstone type figure who really articulated an actual left alternative within national Democratic politics. It became pretty clear, long before he ran for president, that that's really just not the kind of guy we were dealing with. And so, in terms of the Krugman critique on economic policy, I'm not at all surprised to see him, governing as this sort of like technocratic neoliberal, because I think that's what he appeared to be initially. There's on the left, there's two kind of broad, sets of views about the Democratic Party and mainstream liberalism. There's those who feel that having Democrats in power is that is kind of like a misdirection, and it just co-opts people and distracts them from making more radical critiques. The view that the side that I tend to come down on is that it's even though these people like Barack Obama are not our friends, when they're in power, it's possible to build movements of the left that can sort of pressure them from the outside, whereas the Republicans in power are basically impervious to that, and having Republicans in power sort of forces the left into an alliance with liberals just to maintain the rudiments of human civilization. So the problem from my perspective with Obama was that the crisis came along, and there wasn't a movement in place to really push for some kind of more serious radical or even liberal solution to really take on the way finance capitalism had developed and had sort of led us to that point. And so, and Occupy and all that stuff came along afterwards, and it was great partly for the reason that it represented that kind of outside force. But, in 2008, that was just not what was happening. The other thing, though, is, the Greenwald critique that you mentioned is, on civil liberties stuff. That's where I find myself a little bit more actually surprised and disappointed at the way that Obama has continued and intensified the authoritarian tendencies of the Bush administration, with arrogating to itself the right to assassinate anybody it wants, the treatment of Bradley Manning, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's sort of depressing that despite the fact that Occupy and all that has managed to put inequality back on the table, move the conversation away from this ridiculous sort of deficit reduction nonsense. When it comes to civil liberties and sort of executive power, there's just been very there's lonely voices like Glenn Greenwald, but really there's been very little progress.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think Glenn Greenwald, as someone who's kind of a wonky blogger and deals a lot with the employment numbers and all that stuff in the kind of conventional think tank world, everyone understands the economy is bad, right? If you did not see it around you, you would see it in the unemployment numbers. And people like Krugman, people like myself, can point to a number every month and say, this is how bad the economy is. And then we have to make a critique of what can be done about it and what can't be done about it. But for Greenwald and with the civil liberties stuff, there was so much energy about the idea that Obama was going to come in and change things. And if you weren't a person who watched it very closely, it was very difficult to understand that there was a deep continuity between the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. And Greenwald was one of a small select group of people who really created that critique out of thin air. Every day writing out, here's what's happening. And it's not clear to me what can be done about it. The employment will probably never get so terrible that the Federal Reserve or somehow the Obama administration won't do something about it. Our problem is that they seem somewhat indifferent on whether or not they get to 5% unemployment in 2 years versus 6 years. But I think we won't see 20 or 30% unemployment going into this crash. And there's obviously electoral reasons to do that, a whole bunch of other reasons. It's not clear to me what the pressure points are anymore with civil liberties. I think there was a real sense that Obama would sweep in with a team that would clean this out. I think Greenwald has a deep critique that liberals are essentially turning a blind eye to this, and I think there's a deep thing. I think that's fundamentally true in a lot of ways. I think the Senate's also a big problem in a way a lot of people don't rightly criticize. I think Obama's desire not to pick huge fights, especially with Congress, is extra problematic in this space, where it doesn't seem like Obama has picked fights where he knows he would lose them, and knowing that these would be very contentious fights with many members of Congress doesn't seem to be in the play. Right. And when it came to Bush, the Iraq War, as controversial and devastating as it was in terms of human scale, it was obviously a way to coalesce a group around the Bush foreign policy and civil liberties agenda writ large. With Iraq, you had Abu Ghraib, you had the waterboarding problems of the torture and illegal activities. You had the dismissal of the UN and weapons inspectors, etc. And it's interesting because the Iraq War really, It coalesced groups, and then the people who were obviously disillusioned with it immediately or within a year or two, including a lot of the liberal hawks, also became critics. And it's interesting that we don't see that with Iran, for instance, which is clearly having the same people saying the same things about weapons of mass destruction. Even though that drum beats very loud, we definitely don't see it with things like Guantanamo or the recent bills that were passed or the awful speech that was just given the other day by Halder. What's your sense there, someone who's maybe a step outside of it? Is this something that's just, is this something that is now, is Obama like Eisenhower to the New Deal, where Eisenhower took some of the rough edges off of it, but essentially created hegemony around this new way of doing government? And you said as Obama's essentially, since he did not combat it immediately, this is now something that will be with us for a generation?
I mean, that's very much what I'm afraid of. Because it has become sort of normalized now. It's no longer sort of Bush's radical attack on civil liberties and the Constitution. It's just the way things are now. And to sort of sharpen the point about why there isn't a lot of resistance to this. Part of the problem too, I think, is that with the economy stuff, it's it doesn't affect everyone equally. Like, we know that it's things are much better for college grads than they are for other people, but it's still a much more sort of a broad-based issue. The people that feel the brunt of the national security state, or the other sort of like authoritarian parts of the government are, Muslims, undocumented immigrants, a handful of, anti-war activists who get raided by the FBI. And, it's just that makes it much harder to get, your average middle-class white liberal to pay attention to this stuff.
So one last piece on this topic, you briefly touched on, but I'm kind of curious, how has the left broadly, and you, especially from an intellectual point of view, dealt with the financial crisis? Because one thing there was obviously a lot of people who took the financial crisis and the subsequent kind of Great Recession to be the death toll of laissez-faire neoconservative capitalism. That hasn't happened in practice, but it's certainly something that people were engaged with as a topic of conversation. You've seen libertarians go huge lengths to try to blame the government for all the financial crisis, blaming Acorn and Fannie and Freddie and the Consumer the Reinvestment Act and all this other stuff, when it's obviously very clearly a creation of Wall Street, for better or worse. And so there was a sense that the right would be kind of have a death blow against it, even after 10 years of just terrible economic indicators of the Bush years. But what I haven't sensed is that the left has stepped in with a coherent, well, here is what needs to be done otherwise. And when you look at the Great Depression, you realize how ad hoc the social welfare state was. I was reading something the other day about how, a lot of this, this stuff way better than I do, but a lot of stuff comes from Sweden, where the socialists essentially took over by accident because all the other parties lost faith. And, they essentially had to start making up stuff. And they're like, well, why don't we just start hiring people? This guy named Keynes thinks it's a good idea. And, you see in the United States a lot. Alan Brickley wrote a great book called The End of Reform, which essentially said that the first 4 years were just kind of stumbling around until they got this process of government spending to balance the business cycle and the welfare state to compensate people who fall through it. I get the sense that there's no real step in for this kind of left neoliberal hegemony we can kind of articulate later, but essentially like Larry Summers is running the Obama administration's economics team, and that's what we have to go with. There's nothing to the left of it. There is no alternative, to use the loaded phrase, on the economics kind of meta front and the financial capitalism we're in. And I'm kind of curious how you think, is that fair, that there's essentially nothing there that's I don't want to say nothing, but there's not a systematic alternative other than a critique? Or what do you see on that more broadly?
I mean, I don't know if there's a systematic alternative necessarily, but there's certainly, there's a huge menu of sort of alternative policies that simply aren't, that are, because they challenge the power of finance capital, have not been in the conversation, right? And so it's not for lack of, it's not that we sort of like lack ideas of what to do, whether it's being, whether it was being more aggressive about, writing down bad debt, or whether it's being, or more aggressive about, propping up demand by actually giving money to like people who need it rather than to banks. I mean, it's the lack of, it's not so much lack of alternatives as the lack of ability to sort of challenge the entrenched powerful actors here who are still attempting to keep the system going in the same form that it was in before.
Right. There's moments where Krugman kind of, it doesn't blow up, but he there's a lot of people who think this crisis shows the need for alternative economic theories, and Krugman says no, we need to use the ones we already know work, which are employing people and giving them money and getting demand up and rebuilding our infrastructure that's dying and all this stuff. So yeah, I think that's right. That there's just trying to recapture what's been lost is actually a painstaking battle that seems to not be going very well. So.
Right. Well, and it's the thing of it is, where it's just like confronting the same, the inherent tension that capitalism always faces between the fact that the people at the top want to control all the money, but ultimately the system relies upon having enough aggregate demand, for sort of a profit-making capitalism to be possible, right? And so, but like nobody's willing to sort of admit what they eventually had to admit in the New Deal, which is that you have to say redistribution is necessary, even from an internally capitalist perspective.
Excellent. So I'm gonna segue over to Occupy, where you had mentioned it before as changing the conversation. Mm-hmm. One thing I think everyone kind of has a opinion of Occupy. Occupy Wall Street, both what happened in the fall, what happened with the police, and breaking up all the different occupations across the country, and as it tries to reform as the spring comes and is facing a lot of legal pressures and a lot of other external pressures. One tension there, and I think I want to talk a little insider on this, but liberals love Occupy. I think it's very obvious, right? Unions spend a lot of time trying to think of how to engage them. Political, and I don't think for cynical or bad or exploitative reasons, though there are those reasons. I think people in the liberal space are just excited that people are talking about inequality, they're talking about things, and that there's an actual youthful energy that in some ways the administration set up and then just let disappear. And also the administration spent a lot of time making sure grassroots were not that active of a presence, which is a whole other story. But the idea that there's this groundswell of energy for a vaguely left thing, right? Even though it's an incoherent thing, even though it doesn't necessarily make specific demands, that's almost, if anything, a helpful thing. Yeah. In the sense that it changes the conversation. I joked with a guy named Malcolm Harris, who's a very militant occupier, yes. And I joked with him that as a liberal, I view this as whole good cop, bad cop thing.
Oh, no, absolutely.
I'm like, you guys, the system need to deal with us conventional liberals, lest our partners come in the room and go nuts, and God knows what they're going to do.
Yeah, I think maybe something that the liberals learned from the Tea Party is that like having some lunatics off to your fringe somewhere can be very helpful in promoting your political agenda,
Exactly. But I noticed a tension. Maybe it's just because of the people I read, and it wasn't a huge tension. I don't think anyone denounced Occupy or anything like that. But there was a tension within some of the more social democratic people. I'm going to say statists, but that's not necessarily the right word. But people who view a very strong role for the state on the left, and the much more anarchist, flat level, actual people you saw in practice at the General Assemblies, and the ideology that kind of came with this whole communization of public spaces. Jacobin had a big event last fall where Malcolm Harris and Natasha Leonard were there representing the more anarchist tradition, and Doug Henwood and Jody Dean much more on the strong state tradition. And it was kind of chaotic. It was a really fun event, but people were yelling at each other, and it got really intense. And it was exciting to see ideas that prominent in these debates. But I'm curious to give an example, if the audience is not following me, I was at an N+1 event on Occupy, and there was someone who is very active who said any interaction with the state is illegitimate, and Occupy needs to have that role, that it can't make demands of the state because that's just fundamentally illegitimate. And then someone else pointed out, someone who's a disabilities rights activist, very, very intense, very awesome crew of people, said, look, if the state doesn't show up and cut corners in my curbs, I can't get around in my wheelchair. I can't, I can't get to the Occupy event. Occupy event is, like I need the state to do things to make sure I can participate in the public space as a free and full citizen. And it's really offensive to me that you don't even understand that.
Right.
And that tension was always a little bit there, and I never thought it blew up to the point that was a big problem. But I'm curious what you think, because I know you think critically about this stuff.
Well, I mean, I guess, the thing, I sort of look at that, first of all, the first thing that should be said, of course, is that not, this picture you've sketched out of this sort of like unwillingness to make any demands on the state doesn't characterize, all anarchists, but it's sort of a strain of anarchist or anarchist-influenced thinking that certainly was prominent within Occupy and has been prominent on the left really more and more since the end of the Cold War, I think. This stuff was in the air during the globalization movement 10 years ago or more. And, I tend to think of that sort of strain of like really sort of militantly anti-statist anarchism as kind of the radical evil twin of neoliberalism. Because both of them are sort of reject the welfare state as stultifying and bureaucratic and whatever, and it's for different reasons, obviously, and the alternatives they present are different ones, right? It's to dissolve the state in favor of the market or in favor of sort of the, collective, building the commons outside of the state. But
a general assembly.
Right. But in both cases, it's this idea that the state is something that just has to be rejected and abandoned, right? And I guess my view is I'm more social democratic in the sense that I think that there's an incredibly important role for the institutions of the welfare state in actually creating the conditions for, people's autonomy and liberty, right? That because the thing, that in freeing people from dependence on the boss, which is the real alternative to dependence on the state. But I also take seriously the critiques that come out of both the sort of neoliberal and anarchist strains of critique, which is that the state, state can be a form of bureaucratic domination. It can be in the sort of Foucauldian critique. It can be sort of an apparatus for sort of disciplining people and making them sort of, conform to the needs of a capitalist society. And so I think we have to think, I don't want to pose it as a question of being for or against the state, but of thinking about the ways in which particular ways of forming the welfare state either are or aren't conducive to individual liberty. And this is something that, I know you've spent some time writing and thinking about as well.
Right. So, there's two directions here. I wanted to stay with Occupy for 1 second, but then follow through on what you just talked about. It's interesting what the future of Occupy will be. Two of the most prominent, I don't say blow-ups, but obviously tensions within what I've seen recently have been about how broadly construed the audience for Occupy is. Mm-hmm. Right now, especially in Zuccotti Park, it was a place you could bring your kids, right? It was not a threatening space, it was not a violent space. It was a space that, consciously or unconsciously, was very welcoming to a wide range of people. And there was Chris Hedges, who's not a squishy liberal by any means. He wrote a big thing against Black Bloc, the attempts for people to just to generalize, to cover their faces and become and signal that there could be violence, that things could get smashed. And there was a big back and forth about it. A lot of people said it was over dramatic. It was using very worrisome language. But his ultimate critique was that we need the space to be accessible to everyone. Right. We don't want it to be dominated by a small, heavily ideological, violent group of a small cohort, but we want it to be accessible to everyone. And there was also several debates, given that the occupations were a public space that provided public goods, right? They gave people food, they gave people shelter. There's like libraries and daycare and remedial healthcare. They ended up attracting a lot of people who had very serious needs and were in need of much more serious social work. People with strong drug dependencies, mental illness, people prone to violent outbursts. So there were some rumors and some evidence maybe that New York cops were bringing homeless people who were quasi-schizophrenic to the New York encampment to like be there and cause trouble. And there's a big debate about whether or not I don't think a lot of people saw this unless they were watching the debate closely about whether or not those people should be excluded or whether or not they should be encouraged to go elsewhere because Occupy did not actually have the means to provide real serious social welfare to them. I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I do think that's an interesting tension about how broadly accessible the movement is, because you do see people who worry that it's I don't want to say it's too expansive, that it's too interesting to people, but that being that broad prevents people from really engaging ideologically with it, if that makes sense. And I think that's a made-up problem, but I'm just curious what you kind of think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that I have that. Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue with this whole issue of where the cops encouraging homeless people to come into the camps as a way of sort of subverting them. I mean, it points to the limits of trying to build an alternative to the welfare state from scratch from the outside, right? But I mean, on the topic of the black bloc and this Chris Hedges thing, that I think brought up a different issue that I think is interesting, which is that there are sort of two debates about tactics here. One is the tactic of fighting with the cops, and the other is the tactic of denouncing people for fighting with the cops, neither of which I think are particularly good tactics. So one of the things that, and this ties back actually to our sort of the civil liberties discussion earlier, one of the things that Occupy put in view of a lot of people that hadn't seen it before is the militarization of the police in the United States. And, my feeling is that the trouble with a lot of these sort of debates about what Occupy should have done to be more inclusive or whatever is that it sort of assumes that there's sort of the violent and repressive end in which a lot of these occupations ended up could have been avoided by the occupiers being nicer somehow or being more clever tactically. When I don't think that that's the case in a lot of these circumstances, and I think the real problem is how do we deal with a situation in which the state and the police still have a certain amount of legitimacy in claim when they go out and make sort of ridiculous claims about what they've done and what they had to do,
Right. And it's interesting how radicalizing that is. Michael Harrington's The Other America in the preface notes that he went to jail as part of I don't know if it was civil rights related or what it was, but he ended up spending a night in jail, and you could tell it I don't know if you want to say it radicalized him, but it certainly reorientated how he views how the state deals with poor people, and I think it's obviously very influential to his critique about how the state has essentially created null zones around huge pockets of poverty.
Right.
And it is curious. I used to live in the Bay Area, and I know a lot of people are very active in the anti-privatization fights at UCal. And all the beatings and violence at Berkeley and at Davis, I know it's radicalized a lot of people who have not actually, weren't particularly radical to begin with. And I mean, I'm kind of curious how that will play out in the long run. I mean, the hegemony of the way policing is done now, much like civil liberties under Bush, is so strong. Even now, when I think people really understand we have a serious problem with the criminal justice system, it's not clear where they want to go with it or how they want to undo it.
Right.
I want to roll back to something you had just mentioned about the way these kind of anarchist left critiques, which you see more and more of, can coincide with left neoliberal critiques. Mm-hmm. And it's something clever people have pointed out, and it's something that I think we should discuss a little bit. What we mean by neoliberalism is obviously a little bit of a complicated story that goes to Foucault and governmentality, but to briefly summarize, it's a view of the government that still has a welfare state, except it's entirely done through private markets. Mm-hmm. It's primarily focused to helping the poor instead of broadly empowering middle-class people, or people broadly. It's irregardless of their standing in civic society. It's broadly focused towards compensating people after the fact rather than helping them up front. So instead of unions, you get an earned income tax credit, which boosts your wages instead. And then it's very focused, instead of on demand management, it's more focused on things like education and winning the future, which is what Obama announced with 10% unemployment, right, much to the chagrin of traditional liberals. I think that's a fair statement, right?
Yeah.
For the purpose of this conversation, we're going to run with that, and we can include some other stuff. But an anchor for it is that there's this really amazing conversation between two people I know and whose work I greatly respect. Astra Taylor, the filmmaker, who writes for N+1 often, and Dana Goldstein, the education wonk, who writes for Slate and is affiliated with New America and in The Nation. Astra Taylor wrote about her experience as being unschooled, this was what she referred to it, which is, for our purposes, a lefty homeschool. It was being educated in the home by parents, but in a non-traditional format. Dana Goldstein wrote about that and other kind of lefty homeschoolers, which is actually a thing. I know some people who are interested in this. They're concerned about all kinds of things. But Dana said, this is very problematic for progressives. And her critique was a couplefold. One is that it removes people who are serious about education or people who are serious about civic society from the public sphere. So they retrench, and then they're left in this private market of private goods. But it ultimately withdraws that talent from the public sphere. It's a technique that's not accessible to the majority of people. Some people can do this if they can afford to have full-time labor in the home. But for many people, especially people in struggling school districts, everyone's working, or there's only one parent, or they would benefit from having a professionalized workforce, administer education, and then other people brought up outside of Dana is that it mimics this kind of anarchist. We don't necessarily trust the public school system to educate our children. It really kind of sounds a lot like the right wing, right? So when you have this kind of DIY education, how is that conceptually different than DIY old age pensions or DIY healthcare, which is the Ryan plan. And they've had a fascinating discussion that went back and forth, but I want to get your initial impressions of it before we delve in a little bit further.
Yeah, I guess, the thing, so, when in this debate, what, Astor Taylor eventually sort of went back to in her response to Dana Goldstein was to say, well, I'm not, I wasn't, saying that I'm against, demanding universal education or funding for education, but I wanted to point to these alternatives in order to say, to say that to open a space for a deeper critique of schooling that goes beyond it just being unequal, right? To saying that we should, and I'm sympathetic to that, even though it's not entirely adequate, because I do think that the issues with education are more than just that, that it's people have such unequal access to it, but that we're more and more, the mindset is that the purpose of the educational system is just to produce, the necessary laborers of the future rather than having any kind of broader civic purpose. But I generally agree with Goldstein's position that we really need to. It's the people who are educated, people who are affluent, and who have somewhat radical views are the ones who most need to be involved and most need to be sort of engaged with these institutions. And it's the sort of from the anarchist perspective, the thing that is most worrisome, right, about the school system is the way that you see it as reproducing class hierarchies and other kinds of hierarchies, right? But class hierarchies reproduce themselves outside of outside of the public institutions, and we've seen the studies that show that basically if you come from like a rich, well-educated family, you can actually sort of do fine wherever you go to school because you have so much other sort of social capital to fall back on. And it's like just getting, there's a sort of an admirable humanism to the idea that we don't need the state to sort of paternalistically give people culture or tell them what to do. We can let people, learn on their own, but it's just not that simple.
A big problem, I think, and Astor did not go the final step, but Astor brought up, when we say that we need to be engaged in our schools, the people who will often make those claims or have the background, social and cultural capital to be aggressive with this have fundamentally isolated themselves from poor people functionally and spatially.
Yes.
And where, beyond just reproducing class hierarchy, when you look at poor public schools, they're essentially zones where the primary pedagogical idea is crime control and body management, right? It's not about, right, there's, undercover cops, there's all kinds of other problems. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what I wanted to go through with this. Oh, but so Astor pointed out that unless you really have an aggressive call for assimilation, desegregation, busing, I don't know if you brought like a lottery system like that was really like statewide lotteries for school spots or whatnot. But unless you're particularly aggressive with assimilation or across class boundaries in education, the critique loses a lot of its normative edge. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we don't see under things like this kind of left neoliberal government. I don't actually know Obama's policies on schools on that kind of critique, though I know they're very heavily weighted towards testing and value-added teacherness and all that stuff. But it certainly doesn't strike me as a big priority for the Democratic Party. It is revisiting the busing incidents of the '60s. So. I'm kind of curious as what can be done at that point outside of putting your kid in a district where you think it would help everyone, kind of thing, individual action, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and that's tough, and I don't really know. I mean, it's tough because we're so. I mean, the way education is structured is such a mess in the United States. The way sort of spatially, it's so tied to this spatial class segregation. It's hard to know how to begin sort of mounting the more radical critique of it that's necessary, I think.
So I'm curious to follow through on that. Curious what you see as the future of liberalism right now. I haven't actually prepped you for this, but last week Mark Schmidt talked with a conservative intellectual named William Vogel, I think is the right way to say his name, who wrote a book. I forgot, but it argued that there is no end to liberalism. It has a kind of insatiable hunger to do things. The kind of catch idea is that if you call the government a dragon slayer, it's important that you never run out of dragons.
Right.
And he had this whole critique of liberalism that essentially that it was never going to run out of things to do, and it essentially would overrun it's a very conservative critique, it would overrun the system's capacity to innovate and grow and actually be able to do the things liberals want it to do. Where Mark pointed out, conceptually with Obamacare being passed, the main core of the New Deal is complete. Third Way, and I think Matt Iglesias and a couple other people wrote about this idea at the end of the liberal government project being complete. Right. And by that they meant, if you picture, they didn't use this metaphor, but if you picture a stereo with a bunch of knobs, right? All the knobs are in place, and we can turn them up or turn them down, right? Like we can turn up how generous healthcare is, we can turn down how generous old age pensions are. But essentially, in terms of, and those will be very complex fights. And we could see huge differences if the Ryan plan is passed to reconciliation next year. But in practice, everything's sort of in place. Now it's just a debate of how generous we want it to be. But the main functionality of it is in place. And thus that there's not a clear next step for liberalism outside of a couple things that didn't happen, like global warming and immigration, which are huge issues. But in terms of the welfare state and the administration of it, it's more or less in place, which to me is somewhat depressing because it's not clear how to respond to that. And as someone who's a little bit outside that debate, I'm kind of curious what you would think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem I have with that way of looking at things is that it has a premise that I reject, which is that there's this sort of like telos, this sort of like liberal end of history in which you reach a sort of like stable democratic welfare capitalism. Whereas I take the radical perspective that capitalism itself is riven with an irresolvable tension between capital and labor, and that that as it's the solutions that it invents to solve one problem then lead to new problems in the future, right? So there's sort of two broad categories of problem that capitalism gets itself into, right? There's the one we've been dealing with, in our present crisis where not the gains from growth have not been going to labor at all, and so there's a shortfall of aggregate demand, which the ruling class is not able or willing to deal with. But then there's an opposite kind of problem that happens, and that I think you could argue is what happened, in the crisis of the 1970s, when ultimately labor, if the welfare state really does, decommodify labor in the sense of giving workers the ability to make confident demands against the boss, to sort of resist work discipline, it challenges not just profitability, but sort of the, political stability of the system. And it's that sort of seesawing back and forth, from crisis to crisis that I tend to think characterizes the tension between sort of, liberal and conservative flavors of capitalism, rather than this idea that we just sort of reach this harmonious endpoint.
Excellent. I'm reading a book. Have you read Envisioning Real Utopias?
Yes, I have. I'm a big fan of Eric Olin Wright.
There's a metaphor in here that I really like, thinking about where liberalism should go from here, and where perhaps the left, I can't speak for it, should go from here. Is he argues, and it's a metaphor that has stuck with me in light of where we're at in the Obama administration. He argued, and he's talking to a much further left audience, that the idea of a roadmap is over. That Marx provided the left with a roadmap, when the roadmap has two obvious elements of it. It has an end goal, where you want to end up, and also has directions, so that you can do this and you get there very quickly. Though it's a tough road, there's another you can back up a little bit and lose and get further away, but then it's much quicker to get there, and so on and so forth. He says that's over, that there's no more end goals and there's no more directions to get there. And that the best he can hope for is the idea of a compass, right? He calls it his socialistic compass, that you can know whether or not you're getting closer or further away from some goals. Like there's a North Star in the sky, and there's a couple, and though the end goal isn't clear, it's not a space on a map, but it's a kind of general direction, and you can kind of talk about whether or not you're getting closer or further away. I think that's conceptually really fascinating, but and I'm kind of curious what you think of that as a metaphor for where political change will go in this kind of very dark time over the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it is a good way of thinking about things, and it's even, it was Marx who warned us against writing recipes for the kitchens of the future. That for that the metaphor of the compass is useful in thinking about, not having a sort of a plan, a roadmap for the future that sort of subverts the democratic possibility of inherently not knowing exactly where we're going to end up. I mean, I find it useful in thinking too about a time in which, the old left sort of dichotomy of between reform and revolution no longer seems to make sense in the same way that it did, since the sort of insurrectionary model of the seizure of state power is no longer, is sort of discredited on the left. And it's more a question of sort of what are the implications of different paths of reform, some of which are more radical than others. And I think in thinking about my own politics, I have a compass direction, a lot of which has to do with freeing people from the dependency on wage labor that is at the core of living in a capitalist society, right? And which I find helpful in thinking about aspects of sort of of both liberal and left projects that I think point us in a sort of liberatory direction, and those which only just tend to reproduce the sort of alienating aspects of the society that we live in.
Excellent. And so let's conclude with a talk about jobs, since you brought it up. You have written a bunch of posts that I think are just really fascinating and interesting about about the experience of work and the future of work. Yeah. And I don't know how you want to start. I'd like to talk a little bit about your idea of Four Futures, which was a magazine article. We'll try to put it in the sidebar. If not, you can just Google it. Peter Frase, Four Futures. Jacobin article about building off something you had talked about anti-Star Trek, and what it will look like if we can just make things without having to work.
Right.
And then maybe, and then we'll segue a little bit into Foxconn and robots and how that looks in practice as we go forward. So can you lay out a little bit of the Four Futures vision?
Yeah, this all originated in sort of thinking I was doing about the debates we have about intellectual property, patent and copyright law, those sorts of things. And, being a nerd, I grew up watching Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is, centered around one of the premises of the show is the technology of the replicator, where you have free energy and a device that can just make whatever you want, whenever you want it. And so,
if I can interrupt for 1 second, I actually, Connor Kilpatrick, who writes for Jacobin, was encouraged me to revisit this episode where Star Trek Next Generation is the first season where it's much more about socialism and not about fighting things. Where they find 20th century humans in space, in a freezer, and they bring them on board, and then they just mock them for the rest of the episode. It's amazing. There's a guy who wants to know how his stocks are doing, and Patrick Stewart seems so offended that he is concerned about his money. And someone's occupation is a homemaker, and Data, the robot, wonders if it's some sort of how a person actually makes a home from bricks. Right.
Well, and there's a whole alien race that the Ferengi, who are constructed to be who are these acquisitive, they want to acquire money and material things, and they're the recurrent butt of jokes throughout the series, right? As these just backwards, so, it's ridiculous.
Now that we've nerded out, back to the job talk.
Right. So the idea is basically, it's one persistent trend throughout the history of capitalism is that less and less labor is required in physical production, right? Automation, is a recurrent concern. Automation is a recurrent concern of the left, right? It destroys jobs, but at the same time it makes possible a world in which we have to work very little, or in the sort of, if you take it to its ultimate limit, not at all, right? And that utopia used to have a much more prominent place on the left than it does now. There's a tradition going back to Marx about thinking in this way. There was in the 60s, people talked about this a lot more. Even, Keynes has this famous essay on economic possibilities for our grandchildren, in which he thinks that the big problem of the future is what are we going to do with all of our free time.
Right. It's amazing.
That he actually uses the phrase, which I love in light of recent events. He says, "How will we occupy the leisure?"
Why hasn't anyone done an Occupy Leisure sign?
I don't know. I think we may have an essay about this about that, reflecting on that Keynes essay in the upcoming issue of Jacobin.
Pulling up my copy of Essays in Persuasion, which everyone should read.
But of course, what's happened since Keynes is that that prophecy didn't come true. The working time has among the employed has remained fairly stable. Of course, with women entering into the labor force, the aggregate amount of wage labor that we're all doing per capita is higher than ever in a lot of cases. And I think there's so I'm not going to sort of lay out the whole argument about for futures. What it tries to do is to sort of say to take this premise, like suppose we could eliminate all labor in physical production. What are the possibilities? And like some of them are these utopian scenarios in which we don't have to work, but then there are also ways in which you can maintain the form of the capitalist work society even when it should be obsolete, and the world of pervasive intellectual property is one of the ways in which that can happen, right?
Right. The idea is if Picard had to essentially pay an iTunes fee every time he ordered his hot Earl Grey tea, that it would essentially destroy the potential for a real utopia, a real kind of post.
Right.
Whatever would come next would not happen. It would just replicate this going forward.
Right. You would have a small class of rentiers who make money from this stuff, and then people would have to work because they're paying for things that technologically can be copied for free, right?
Right, and there's all kinds of interesting debates, and given how the internet, Julian Sanchez said, our new public sphere is essentially a giant copying machine. Mm-hmm. These tensions about copyright are going to get even more so. I want to back up a little bit. There was an article, I forgot the full context, but he went back and forth with a few other blogs about those machines in supermarkets, right. The self-checkout machine in supermarkets. And they were being pulled, I assume because they weren't profitable, people didn't like them, they're kind of annoying, the upkeep was hard. And a lot of left liberals thought that was a good thing, right? Because now we can put a person working that job in. And as you pointed out, in a great essay you wrote out, the case against jobs, it's like that's actually a crap job. Like that's not a good job. Like why wouldn't we celebrate being able to replace that with a machine who presumably we don't think it cares that they have a crap job, and if robots become sentient, this whole thing changes. But for the time being, and I thought that was interesting because it is a serious conflict, and you see it with automation all the time, and you see with some of the panic about robots taking our jobs. And I'm kind of curious how you would respond to a egalitarian liberal, someone who's very concerned about social justice, but someone who really does not like the idea that robots are taking our jobs. How would you kind of respond to them?
Well, I think there's this. This is sort of combined. These are the two themes that come up a lot in sort of critiques that I have of these trends among liberals and on the left, which is getting away from the left's critique of work and wage labor itself, and being sort of skepticism about the technology having any liberatory potential for us, really. And both of those, I think, are tied to being in a period of just sort of like pessimism and defeat, right? Like it's hard to talk about escaping from work when, the most immediate problem facing us is that, people living in misery because they can't find jobs, right? And it's hard to think about the liberatory potential of technology when it seems like every new innovation just ends up being another way for the capitalists to screw us. But that's ultimately just a defensive, a pessimistic, and a backward-looking perspective, right? That just puts us constantly on the back foot, and that inevitably that there's it's really difficult to escape the dialectic by which the labor struggles to get its share from capital, and capital struggles to escape from labor by replacing it with machines, right? And we could talk about the Foxconn thing, which I also wrote about recently. I don't know if this is the point.
I think that'd be great if you want. If you want to just go, I'm sure people know I'm recording this on an Apple product. Maybe people are watching it on an Apple product, and there's been a big set of articles, mostly coming from Mike Daisy's one-man show, which is pretty fantastic, about the conditions under which Apple products are made in a set of factory towns called Foxconn in China, and the Mo Tislak, a writer at Reuters, reviewed Steve Jobs' biography, and she had spent some time in China, and she had talked about your vision of a sweatshop, the places that make sneakers and make high-end designer bags, isn't probably as oppressive as you think it is.
Right.
But Foxconn, however, was run as kind of a militarized operation. That the thing that kicked off these Foxconn riots and suicide pacts really what kicked it off. Was one person delivered, sent a package to San Jose, to where Apple is, and it was missing one of the iPhone containers. And, there's footage that was leaked of him after 3 days of being interrogated. And they, flipped his house, they went to his family. No one knows if he was tortured, but it certainly did not look like he was treated very well when they were asking him essentially about something that went missing at work, and he eventually jumped off the top of the building, killing himself, which gives you a sense of the real, beyond things being someone not getting paid very much, or besides someone having a kind of bad work atmosphere, there's the kind of totalitarian pressure that's really, really scary from the point of view of labor rights. And so and you had some interesting reactions to what happened after the people who had essentially went on strike, got a lot of concessions.
Right. And so I looked at this, and so at the first cut is that this is an example, a great example of sort of labor struggle in the 21st century, right? I mean, in a lot of the media, like the American media, in typical sort of like the typical fashion you get in the absence of a left critique, it was portrayed as Apple. It was portrayed from the consumer side as like Apple, reforming itself because of bad PR. But I mean, from my perspective, the most important thing is the struggle of the workers themselves. In the fashion of workers throughout the history of capitalism, organizing and challenging some really, really awful conditions, and getting higher wages, but probably more importantly, some changes in the working conditions, including reduction of overtime, which it's just the familiar labor story of workers have to come together and organize for their rights, but then. There was another aspect to the story that I thought was interesting, which popped up in the corners of some of these stories, which was you had talking to Foxconn executives talking about, well, in response to this, they're going to look at maybe automating some of this stuff, and that replacing these ornery workers with robots, and that is that's the dialectic that recurs time and time again, and I think that there's if you like seeing sort of collective action of workers to demand better wages and better working conditions, one ought to recognize and I think on some level welcome that leads at sort of the next step down the line to those jobs potentially being replaced with machines. And then the question, of course, becomes at a higher level: what do we do as a society if jobs are disappearing and most people are still dependent on wage labor for survival? What's the response to that? And my view is that the backwards-looking response of we just need to protect jobs at all costs is just not adequate.
Do you think there's a left-right convergence there, Charles? You had a thing you said that you were sad that Charles Murray is now back on this kind of weird reactionary culture war stuff, because he used to be the biggest libertarian supporter of a guaranteed income,
right?
Which you are a fan of as well,
yes.
Guaranteed income. So do you think there's potential for that kind of left-right synergy where the right is, we should just scrap most of what the government does and replace it with essentially a check writing machine? People get and then maybe there are some exceptions for other things. How do you think there's actual intellectual energy between them? I mean, I don't know how much of that's at all practical, but like just intellectually, do you think that there's a synergy there?
To a certain extent. I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, the problem obviously is that the right-wing versions of the basic income entail scrapping aspects of the welfare state that I think are essential, like universal health care, right? And like relying on a market in a way that I think is untenable. But that basic idea that sort of things like targeted means-tested programs ought to be replaced with just universal provision is something that I'm quite in favor of, because it gets away from the sort of paternalistic and stigmatizing qualities of the welfare state. The two things that I think come up in looking at what the left thinks about a basic income versus what the right thinks about it. I mean, one is that the level of a basic income has very odd properties. There's sort of a nonlinear dynamic in which when a very small guaranteed income is sort of a subsidy to low-wage labor, right? Because you still have to go into the workforce, but you can just pay people less. But then above a certain threshold, if it becomes possible to actually survive outside of work, then suddenly you've massively increased the bargaining power of this class of workers at the bottom of the labor market, right? Which would have, I think, extremely radical implications. And so, my thought about it is that if a basic income was ever instituted, it would probably start out at that crappy low-wage labor subsidizing level, but that if we believe that there's a sort of universal social programs have a sort of ratchet-like quality and that it will be easier to raise it than to lower it, then that probably still has good implications for us in the long run. The other thing I think is that in certain ways the basic, things like the basic income are a bit of like a bet on human nature and on social development between the right and left. If you think people are ultimately just have unlimited desire for money and material possessions, then the implications of the basic income are not particularly radical. They just provide sort of a basic floor to make sure that people are not not totally living in misery, but they don't challenge the idea that we spend most of our waking hours and derive most of our social meaning from engaging in waged work. But if you don't believe that, then potentially what might people do? I mean, this goes back to the schooling debate we had. When you talk about one of the problems with unschooling is that most people just don't have the time to spend on it. Well, one answer to that is this is why we need public schools, which I agree with. But another question is, like, what if people had the time? Like, what would really happen?
Right. All right. Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks for joining me. Last question. According to Wikipedia, so I can't guarantee this, but Wikipedia is usually pretty good. How many hours a week does George Jetson work?
9, I believe. Was 9. Is
correct.
Right?
9 hours a week, and perhaps our grandchildren will have that as well. But.
Yeah, perhaps. Probably not the flying cars, but the 9 hours would be nice.
I mean, if it does not involve putting carbon in the air, I'm all for flying cars. We'll see what happens with that. But thank you so much for joining me, Peter, and I hope everyone checks out their work at jacobinmag.org. Is that correct?
jacobinmag.com, I believe. Hold on a second. I'm going to get this right.
.com. It's .com.
Yes,
so,
it is .com.
Because you guys are ruthless capitalists, evidently.
Yes.
jacobinmag.com. And I hope you'll join us next week with Fireside Chats.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mike.